what does this remind you of? Or this? How about this? What about all these things together? Okay, maybe these things mean nothing to you, but to me, and probably a lot of people around my age, this is the sound of a simpler time. This is, of course, The Sims, the first game in the Sims series to be specific. And though the series has had countless sequels and spin-off titles over the years, there's something special about that first game. This is Revibalize, a series where I pick a piece of art that casts a distinct vibe and I try to figure out what exactly gives it that vibe. And at the end of each video, I try my best to recreate that vibe with the various tools at my disposal. Last time we took a look at Mass Effect's Nevaria as an example of brutalist style architecture. And this time we'll be looking at The Sims as an example of, I don't know, how weird the 90s were, I guess. We're not always going to focus on video games in this series, but the first Sims game is really compelling to me because nothing else really feels like it. And I find that strange because The Sims is such a behemoth of an IP with such a consistent identity. The second game looks just like the third game. The third game looks just like the fourth game, which looks like the console games, which looks like the mobile games. They all have this like cartoon wackiness about them. But The Sims 1 is not like that. This game feels entirely different, almost in like an eerie way. I distinctly remember playing this game as a kid and always feeling like a little bit weirded out by it. Like if any game were to be haunted, it would be The Sims. I guess it kind of is haunted, technically, and it'd be super easy to wave away these tonal differences as like simple technological upgrades between The Sims 1 and The Sims 2, but those two games came out only 4 years apart, which I couldn't believe was true when I looked it up. Like, you're telling me The Sims Live in Large, The Sims House Party, The Sims Hot Date, The Sims Vacation, The Sims Unleashed, The Sims Superstar, The Sims Making Magic, and The Sims 2 all came out in 4 years? That seems fake, but okay. But despite knowing that this game obviously feels different from the rest, I've never really been able to explain why. But that changes today because this is Revibalize and that's what we do here. So I strapped in and I did some thoroughly intensive field research into each of the Sims games. And let me tell you, that was a lot harder than breaking down Nevaria. With Nevaria, it was easy to identify specific, concrete, no pun intended, elements that contributed to the vibe of the space. But this is so much more abstract because we're talking about an entire game here. But rather than just telling you what I found, how about we discover those things together? Now, The Sims is all about action. Your Sims are always doing things, and that's going to be our biggest clue here. So let's see what a friendly conversation looks like in The Sims 1 versus The Sims 2. How about getting a little workout in? How about dancing? How about jumping into a swimming pool? What about the moment a Sim catches on fire? Interesting. Now I ran a few more tests of that last scenario just to make sure my findings were accurate, and they were. Now I'm gonna let this last clip run a little bit and I want you to see if you notice anything. Watch this scene and see if you can pick out a few elements that contribute to the overall vibe. And then we'll regroup and we'll see if we're aligned. Okay, so here's the first thing I noticed. The graphics in this game are very weird. And they're weird because they use a rendering technique that's really uncommon in modern games. This game actually uses a combination of 2-dimensional and 3-dimensional assets, all in a 3D space. So the first 2 points of my vibe analysis for The Sims would have to be 2D elements and 3D elements. So in case you didn't notice, the objects in this game are all 2-dimensional. This refrigerator, this hot tub, this whatever this is. They're essentially just 2D pre-animated renders slapped onto a 3D plane. And despite all of these objects being 2-dimensional, the game is able to maintain a pretty convincing illusion of 3D because the object rotations are all fixed. So you'll only ever see an object from one of 4 predetermined angles. And that's really interesting because we're talking about an object that you can pick up, rotate, move around, and interact with in this 3D space. But there's no 3D model here. It's just 1, 2, 3, 4 still images of an object. And that alone, I think, contributes a lot to the eerie vibe that I was talking about. It's almost uncanny. Like your brain knows what's supposed to be represented here, but it's represented in such a way that it low-key just kind of feels off. For example, objects don't have dynamic shadows. So if you put a piece of furniture in the middle of a room and like stare at it for too long, the entire illusion gets broken and it starts to look like everything's just floating. And then of course, the characters themselves are all 3D. They have to be. They're moving around, they're dynamic, but they're very low poly. So it can be strange and a little bit jarring to see all of these ultra detailed, sometimes even photorealistic 2D objects next to these blocky, low-res, low-poly Sims models. And maybe it's just the nostalgia talking. But despite that, I find the end result really iconic. Even though it's very weird and kind of awkward and a little bit creepy, I think it has a lot of character. Especially because you don't really see this style of art direction in games anymore. The next thing I think that really ties the vibe together is in the camera. So earlier, I mentioned that the object angles are fixed, and naturally, so are the camera angles. And that's because the game uses a fixed dimetric camera perspective to maintain the illusion of 3D. Now, since the other Sims games are fully 3D, they can allow free camera moves, but because the art style in this game requires the perfect camera angle in order for the assets to make sense, that's obviously not possible in The Sims 1. And you might not think this is super consequential vibes-wise, but I think that locked camera angle goes a long way in cultivating that iconic Sims 1 aesthetic we all know and love. Because if you think about it, every screenshot of this game that you see has like an insane level of uniformity to it. Like, talk about branding. If you see a screenshot of The Sims 1, it's instantly recognizable as being from The Sims 1. The next thing I'll note vibes-wise is the animation style. When we think of The Sims today, we picture this like ultra-fluid, hyper-animated, exaggerated animation style. It's something that's almost become like a trademark or a meme of The Sims series. Like, we all remember when people were doing TikToks and they were like moving like Sims. It was very weird. And it's interesting because you don't really see that movement in a lot of games nowadays. Like, imagine someone in like GTA or whatever walking like a Sim. It would be so weird to see that. And that's because there's a very specific animation technique that the Sims games use. The modern Sims games very closely follow the 12 basic principles of animation. And the 12 basic principles of animation are a series of animation techniques that were laid out by Disney animators Ollie Johnson and Frank Thomas in the 80s. And these are basically the principles that give cartoons the satisfying, fluid movements we all know and love. So remember earlier I said the series has sort of like a cartoon wackiness about it? Well, that's a big part of it. The characters in The Sims 2 and beyond are animated like cartoon characters. But they're not in The Sims 1. Not really, at least. You could definitely make the argument that some of the movements are exaggerated for like comedic effect or whatever, but we definitely don't see the same adherence to those animation principles that the later Sims do. There's also the matter of how animations flow from one to another. Because there's so many variables in this game, a lot of the actions your Sims take consist of multiple, smaller animations. For example, if you want your Sim to serve a meal, they might have to walk halfway across the kitchen to get from the fridge to the countertop. Or you might have a food processor, so instead of prepping the meal on the countertop, they'll use a food processor. Or maybe you don't have a stove, so instead of cooking a meal, they'll just make a salad. So a simple action like serve a meal actually initiates a string of multiple different animations. And in between all those different animations, you'll notice like all these micro adjustments and instances in which your Sim kind of resets the last animation state to prepare for the next animation. And it's funny because this is almost exactly how we would picture a robot to move. So serve a meal actually turns into something like get ingredients from fridge, walk ingredients to counter, prepare ingredients for meal, walk prepared ingredients to stove, place prepared ingredients on stove, cook meal on stove. And there's nothing really chaining those commands together. It's very robotic, but no joke, I could stare at these little transitions all day. Even though it's low-key janky, it's also a cool little reminder of what's happening under the hood when you play this game. Just like the tremendous amount of if-then statements that happen every single time you tell your sim to do something. It almost makes you think like, if the human brain is basically a computer, and our consciousness is a program, just running through calculations based on external stimuli, and the sims also run through very basic calculations based on very basic external stimuli. For example, being trapped in a doorless room filled with flaming couches. Could there be some tiny spark of consciousness there? I really hope not. Lastly, we have sound design. I'm absolutely more of a visual person, and there's no way I'm even going to be able to attempt the sound design of this game, but the sound design of the Sims game is legendary. I mean, what do I even say about the music? The game starts you off with this absolute banger on the neighborhood screen. The buy menu music makes you want to buy everything. And the music in the build menu, it's almost ominous. If you switch from the buy menu to the build menu, the vibe immediately shifts. Like in the buy menu, we're chilling, we're consuming, we're having fun. Then you click over to the build menu and it's like boom, 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 boom. Like buying was fun, but now this is like it's serious suddenly. When I'm hearing this music, I'm thinking of like the generations of Sims that are gonna live in this house. And it feels like a tremendous amount of pressure, I'm not even gonna lie. And then there's just like the general sound design. The sound design in The Sims is so good that I'm not even joking. You could play this game with no monitor and know exactly what's happening at all times. If you've got dirty dishes lying around, you'll hear flies buzzing. If there's a burglar about to rob your house, they'll play the burglar song. Your Sim's gotta use the bathroom? Don't worry, if they pee their pants, you'll hear it. And then they'll start crying. Legendary sound design. And that takes us to the part of the video where I take a crack at the aesthetic myself. And initially, I didn't really know how I was going to do that, but I knew a pretty good place to start was to set up a dimetric camera in Blender and then set up some sort of a grid system. And then once I did that, I started modeling the furniture based on that grid. And so even before I rendered it out or stylized it or anything, it already had a pretty cool Sims vibe to it. And that really got me thinking what a modern Sims game would look like with the classic dimetric vibe, but more on that later. So then I started turning all these 3D objects into 2D sprites. And I basically just did that by rendering them out with different rotations. And then I placed those images back into the scene as image planes. When it came to the Sims themselves, I got super lucky because someone had actually already extracted the 3D models from the base game. And they even formatted them for Blender and they created a whole armature and rig for them. So I tried to make a sim of myself, which was harder than you might think because this is what the facial map texture looks like, which is bizarre. So I kind of like sloppily copy and pasted my own facial features into that, and I think it kind of looks like me. And then of course, I had to rig and animate the characters themselves. So I took the original Sims models and I improved upon the rig a little bit by adding inverse kinematics. And if you don't know what that does, it basically lets you animate an entire limb by only moving one controller instead of adjusting each individual bone every time you want to move something. So I came up with this scene in my head and I tried to figure out the exact animations I'd need to create for the scene. But then as I was putting it all together, I hit a bit of a problem. Anytime I wanted to make a change to the scene, I'd have to re-render the sprites and put them back in the scene, which was annoying. So I realized, okay, there's gotta be a better way to do this. And there was. Even though it's not like technically 100% historically accurate, what I did was I decided to create 3 separate render layers. One for the walls and floors, one for the objects, and then one for the Sims themselves. This way, I could apply different levels of pixelation and dithering and effects to the different layers, making it still appear as though the objects are 2D sprites and the Sims themselves are 3D. I think the finished product looks pretty good. And may not be exactly Sims-like, but I think if you didn't know any better, you'd probably think this was The Sims. But that got me thinking. For this project, I disabled shadows, disabled path tracing, I used the shittiest effects I could possibly make, and added a whole bunch of pixelation, dithering, and scan lines just to make it look old. But what if we didn't do that? What if we kept the fixed camera and the general Sims aesthetic, but enabled shadows and path tracing, and maybe used some better effects? So I did that, and I present to you The Sims 1 with ray tracing. And after doing all that, I can't help but think, I really wish they would make a Sims game like this. EA, that's my gift to you, okay? In fact, I live in Vancouver. I'll even come on as creative director for this project. And that's it for the second episode of Revibalize. I know it took a really long time for me to make this video, like a month and a half, almost 2 months actually. But I do put a tremendous amount of work into these, and like I have a job and a freelance business and somewhat of a life. So thank you so much to everybody who watched the last video and left such nice comments. I honestly can't tell you how much that means to me and how much I appreciated those kind words. Even if my videos only ever get a couple hundred views forever, knowing that at least a few people found them interesting, or it encouraged them to look at things differently or get creative themselves, then that's worth it to me. It's really special when you have something that you're really excited and passionate about, and you're able to share that with others and get even a little bit of that excitement in return. Whether that's through like an encouraging comment or a sub or something. Yeah, I just want to say thanks. I think the one Revibalize video per month and a half-ish is probably a realistic schedule for me moving forward. But I will try to do more smaller, short-form content in the meantime. Maybe we can like go on little field trips and explore interesting pieces of design without having to make a whole long-form video about it. I'm going to Korea in like a week and a half, so I'm sure I'll see some exciting things out there, and that'll give me some inspiration. But yeah, thanks again, everybody, and stay tuned because, look, I told you there'd be a second video, and guess what? I'm already thinking about a third video too, so there's another one coming. At least one more coming. Thanks again, everybody.